The Fulton County Probate Court keeps its rooms cold. I was told once it's to keep people calm. It does the opposite to me. Cold makes a body brace. I sat in the second row in my Navy suit, the one I wear to funerals and to church when somebody's being honored. My hands were folded over my purse, and inside that purse, where nobody could see my thumb, was pressed flat against a square of old cloth. I'll tell you about that cloth later. For now, just know it was the only warm thing in that room. Across the aisle sat my son. Terrence had on a suit I didn't recognize, and a watch I knew I'd never bought him, 38 years old. He kept his eyes down on the table, on his own folded hands, on the water pitcher, on anything in that room that was not his mother. A man tells you everything you need to know by what he won't look at. Beside him sat their lawyer, Mr. Bradley Knox, with a yellow legal pad and the comfortable face of a man who'd done this many times. And on Terrence's other side sat Mr. Dale Pruitt. Dale Pruitt, I want you to remember, smooth as a river stone, gray suit, gray smile, a leather folder he kept squaring against his knee like the corners might run off without him. He wasn't family. He had no business at that table. But he was the one who'd put the words in my son's mouth, and I knew it, and he knew I knew it, and he smiled at me anyway. The petition had my name on it, Ruby Jean Whitfield, and under my name in the flat language of the law, it asked the court to find that I was no longer of sound mind, that I couldn't be trusted with my own money, my own home, my own self, that I needed a guardian. They wanted a stranger to sign my checks. They wanted my son to hold the pen over my whole life, and they thought they were going to win. You could see it in the way they sat loose, certain already spending what wasn't theirs. They had a doctor's report. They had a story about a confused old woman who couldn't keep her affairs straight. They had everything a court likes to see. What they didn't have was the truth. And the truth I'd learned by then is a patient thing. It waits in a drawer. It waits in a folder. It waits as long as it has to, and it does not get tired the way people get tired. The judge hadn't come in yet. The whole room was holding its breath. I pressed my thumb against that square of cloth and I breathed. I wasn't afraid anymore, because I had something they didn't expect. Who I am. My name is Ruby Jean Whitfield, and for 40 years I opened the same door at 5:30 in the morning. The Blue Door is a diner on the corner of Pratt and Vine in the part of Atlanta where everybody's grandmother knew everybody's grandmother. My husband Clarence and I bought it in 1983 with money we didn't really have and a faith we couldn't really afford. Before the cook came in before the first pot of grits, I'd take a stub of chalk and write the day's specials on the board over the register in my mother's hand, that looping old-fashioned cursive they don't teach children anymore. Smothered pork chops, catfish Friday, peach cobbler while it lasts. 40 years. I could tell you what every booth in that place had seen. People looked at me and saw a small woman in an apron who remembered how you took your coffee. What they didn't see was that I kept the books. All of them. Clarence was the face that man could talk a tax collector into a Christmas card. But the numbers were mine. The diner and the 4 rental houses we bought one at a time across 30 years, the way you eat an elephant. 1 bite, 1 mortgage, 1 tenant at a time. I wrote every dollar down by hand in a ledger with a green cloth cover because a screen can lie to you, and your own handwriting cannot. Over the back booth, the one nobody else was allowed to claim, hung a quilt. My grandmother Hattie pieced it by hand before I was born, and into the border she'd stitched our names, hers and her children's, and the children who came after. That square of cloth I keep mentioning, the one in my purse, I cut from a worn corner of that quilt years ago, so that wherever I went with my people. That's who I was the morning my son decided I was nobody. My boy. I want to tell you about Terrence before I tell you what he did, because otherwise you won't understand why it cut the way it did. When he was a boy, he did his homework in that back booth under Hattie's quilt with a glass of chocolate milk going warm at his elbow. He was a serious child. He'd chew a pencil down to splinters working a math problem, And when he finally cracked it, he wouldn't smile, he'd just nod once like the answer had owed him something and finally paid up. I used to think that one pays attention. That one's going to be all right. I put him through 2 years at Morehouse before the money, and the boy both ran short, and he came home and I told him there was no shame in it. We'd find the next thing. I believed there'd be a next thing for Terrence, the way you believe the sun's coming up not as a hope, as a fact. When his daddy died 2 years back now, it was Terrence who stood beside me at the front of the church and held my elbow so I wouldn't fold. He leaned down and whispered, "I've got you, Mama." And I believed that too. So you understand, this was not a man I had any reason to fear. This was my boy. I had cooled his fevers and signed his report cards and covered his rent more than once when he was grown and proud and too embarrassed to ask out loud. I gave my grandchildren envelopes at Christmas and pretended not to notice when their daddy took them to keep safe. I made Jordan and Imani peach cobbler the same as I'd made him in the same pans. Imani started chalking the specials when she was tall enough to reach the board, copying a cursive she'd learned off her great-great-grandmother's quilt. We were a family. That word meant something to me. It meant the ledger and the quilt and the back booth weren't only mine, they were a thread, and I was holding one end of it, and the children were meant to hold the other end long after I was gone. So when the betrayal came, it didn't come from an enemy you can guard against. It came wearing my son's face, using my son's voice, calling me Mama. That's a particular kind of wound. It doesn't bleed where anybody can see it. The small things. It started so small I nearly talked myself out of noticing. The first thing was a property tax notice on the house at 1147 Pratt Street, one of our rentals, a brick 2-bedroom with good bones. The notice said I was past due. I knew I wasn't. I had the receipt. I'd paid it in person at the county office back in March, the way I always did, and I'd written the date in my green ledger in my own hand. But the first notice never reached my mailbox. The only copy that ever turned up was the second one, the angry one, the kind that makes you doubt yourself. Then a check I'd written to the linen company bounced. Insufficient funds on an account I knew had money in it. When I called the bank, the young woman was kind and confused. There'd been a transfer, she said. Hadn't I authorized it? Then there was a doctor's appointment. I'd supposedly missed a card that turned up loose in my purse, a name and a date for a physician I'd never heard of on a day I'd spent at the diner in front of 40 witnesses. I never made that appointment, but there it sat in writing, looking for all the world like a forgetful old woman's slip. Each thing by itself was nothing. A clerical error, a bank mix-up, a card in the wrong purse. That's the trick of it, each one small enough to explain away, and just enough of them just close enough together that the ground started to move under me. For about 3 weeks, God forgive me, I wondered if it was me, if I was the thing going wrong. And right about then, right when I was at my lowest, doubting my own mind, Dale Pruitt started coming around. Terrence brought him to Sunday dinner like a prize. "Mama, this is Mr. Pruitt. He helps families plan." Helps families plan. He had a soft voice and a way of leaning in close, of resting his hand on the table near mine without quite touching it. He talked about my assets. He talked about how much I had on my plate at my age. He said more than once that a woman who'd worked as hard as I had ought to be allowed to rest and let the people who loved her carry the weight. I smiled and poured his coffee, and I did not like him one bit. There's a kind of man who looks at an old woman and sees a house with the door left unlocked. I'd met that kind before. But it wasn't until I sat down one night with my green ledger and a letter from the county that the bottom truly dropped out. The house at 1147 Pratt Street, my house that Clarence and I bought in 1991, had a mortgage on it. $90,000, taken out 4 months earlier, against a power of attorney. A power of attorney I had never signed. I sat at my kitchen table and read it 3 times. My ears were ringing. Somebody had reached into my life and written my name where my name had no business being. And I already knew the way you know a storm by the smell of the air whose hand had held that pen. Why I went to court. I did what any mother would do first. I went to my son. I drove to Terrence's house with the county letter in my purse, laid it on his kitchen counter, and asked him plain, "What is this?" I watched his face do 3 things in 2 seconds. Surprise, then fear, then something worse, something smooth. I realized later he'd picked up from Dale Pruitt. He told me I must be confused. He told me there'd been some paperwork for my own protection to keep the house safe in case anything happened to me. He said protection the way Pruitt said it, like it was a blanket and not a noose. I said, "Terrence, I did not sign this." And my son looked his mother in the eye and said, "Mama, you don't always remember what you sign anymore." I want you to sit with that a second, because I had to. I left without raising my voice. I'm not a woman who makes a scene. I'm a woman who goes home and thinks. I thought maybe we could still fix it inside the family quiet the way we'd always fix things. I called Sandra, my daughter-in-law, hoping one woman might hear another. Sandra has a way of sounding tired before you've even started. She said, "Mama Ruby, nobody's trying to hurt you. Maybe it's just time you let us take care of things. You're not yourself. You're not yourself." I'd heard that phrase 3 times by then out of 3 different mouths, and I finally understood it wasn't an observation. It was a plan. They weren't telling me I was slipping. They were teaching me to believe it, and teaching everybody around me to believe it too, so that when they took it all, it would look like mercy. A week later, the petition came by certified mail. They'd filed with the probate court to have me declared incapacitated before I could so much as hire a lawyer. They moved first the way you do when you've got something to hide and you're afraid of the clock. That was the morning I stopped being hurt and started being careful. I didn't cry. I made a pot of coffee strong and I sat with my green ledger and I made a list. Then I put on my good shoes and drove downtown to an office I'd been to once before years ago with Clarence, the office of a young lawyer named Renee Foster, who'd been brought up by the same man who used to handle our affairs. I sat down across her desk, folded my hands, and told her the truest thing I knew. My son is trying to steal my life out from under me while I'm still in it, and he is about to find out he picked the wrong old woman. Renee Foster's office sat on the 4th floor of an old building downtown that smelled of wood polish and good coffee, the same smell as the office Clarence used to take me to, which I took as a sign, though I don't put much stock in signs. She was younger than I expected. 40 maybe. Natural hair, pressed suit, and a way of listening that made you feel like the most important file on her desk. I laid all of it out. The tax notice, the bounced check, the appointment I never made, Dale Pruitt in his soft voice, the $90,000 mortgage on 1147 Pratt Street against a power of attorney I never signed, and the petition that came a week after I asked my son one simple question. When I finished, she didn't say, "Oh, you poor thing. I'll always be grateful for that." She said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I'm going to be honest with you because you don't strike me as a woman who wants to be handled." "I am not," I said. "Then here it is. Guardianship is the one kind of case where the law leans against the very person it claims to protect. The judge isn't weighing whether you did anything wrong. He's weighing whether you can be trusted with yourself. And the whole fight comes down to 2 things: the medical record and how you appear. A confident lawyer and a doctor's report can make a sharp woman look lost in 20 minutes. I have watched it happen. And if I lose," she didn't soften it. "If you lose, a guardian signs your checks, sells your houses if he calls it your interest, decides where you live. You'd have to ask permission to spend your own money, and undoing it once it's done can take years you may not want to spend that way." I sat with that. I'd known it was bad. I hadn't let myself hear it said out loud. Then I reached into my bag and set a folder on her desk, thick rubber-banded every scrap I'd been quietly saving since the first week the ground started moving under me. Receipts, ledger pages, dates in my own hand. Bank statements I'd requested in person because by then I'd learned not to trust the mail. Renee opened it, and I watched her eyebrows climb. She turned pages a long while without speaking. "Mrs. Whitfield," she finally said, "most folks come to me with their side of the story. You came with a case." There was one more thing in that folder at the very back. I leaned forward and told her quiet to hold it. Not to list it, not to breathe a word of it until the right moment. She looked at me a beat longer than was comfortable, then nodded slow like she'd just revised her whole opinion of the afternoon. "I'll get to what it was. For now, just remember, it's there." 3 days later, Knox, their lawyer, called Renee with an offer. They'd drop the petition, he said, if I agreed to a voluntary conservatorship. Sign control of my affairs over to my son myself of my own free will, and we could all avoid the unpleasantness of a hearing. Keep it in the family. Spare everyone the embarrassment. Renee called to tell me, and I could hear she half expected me to take it. It was the safe thing. No judge, no risk, no chance of losing it all. "No," I said. "Mrs. Whitfield, I have to advise you a hearing is a real risk. I heard you the first time, and I thank you for it. But you hear me now, Renee. They didn't offer that to be kind. They offered it because they're afraid of what a courtroom might turn up. A guilty man always wants to settle out back where there's no light. We're going to the light." She was quiet a second. Then, "All right, then we better be ready. The days before a hearing are a strange country. You can't do anything, and you can't stop doing. Pearl Dawson came and stayed with me. Pearl and I have been friends since we were girls in pigtails at Mount Olive, and she is the only soul on this earth allowed to tell me when I'm being a fool. She cooked when I forgot to. She sat with me at the kitchen table while I went over Renee's questions again and again. State your name. State your address. What year did you buy the diner? Who keeps your books?" Until the answers came smooth as river stones. Not because I didn't know them, because I'd learned that under pressure, a true thing can come out sounding shaky, and a courtroom doesn't always know the difference. The family came apart in pieces those days quietly. My granddaughter Imani, 14, all elbows and opinions, started texting me in secret. Little things. "Grandma, are you okay? Grandma, I missed the diner. Grandma, I didn't say what they said I said." I never learned the whole of what her parents had been telling those children, but I could read between her lines, and it broke something in me that they'd put my grandbabies in the middle of it. And then on the 4th night, my phone rang, and it was Yolanda, my daughter. We hadn't really spoken in close to 6 years, a falling out after Clarence's funeral that had more grief in it than sense the way those things do. She lives up in Charlotte now. She'd heard. I don't know how. She didn't say I'm sorry, and neither did I. We're too much alike for that. She just said, "Mama, is it true what Terrence is trying to do?" And when I said yes, she was quiet a long time, and then, "That's not right. Whatever's between you and me, that is not right." It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a hand reaching across 6 years of silence. I held on to it. Still, I'll be honest with you, the way I've been honest this whole time. There was a night I almost folded. It was past 2 in the morning. I couldn't sleep, so I called Pearl, and she answered the way she always does, like she'd been sitting up waiting on me. And I said the thing I hadn't said to Renee, hadn't said to anybody. "Pearl, what if the judge just looks at me and sees an old woman?" Because that was the fear under all of it. Not losing the houses, not even the diner. The fear was standing up in front of a room full of strangers and having them decide the inside of my own head didn't belong to me anymore. That my son might be believed, and I might not. I'd been a competent woman my whole life. I had carried that family on my back and in my ledger. And there I lay in the dark, afraid none of it would count for anything against a man in a gray suit with a doctor's signature. "And if I lose," I whispered, "they'll have the children. Maybe I should just sign the thing. Keep what I can. At least then I'd still see Jordan and Imani." Pearl let me say all of it. Then she said, "Ruby Jean, can I ask you something? Go ahead." "That quilt of your grandmama's, whose names are stitched in it?" I didn't answer. "Yours is in there," she said. "Hattie put your name in that border before you could walk. You gonna let some man with a folder talk a judge into taking it back out? I didn't sleep that night, but I didn't fold either. In the morning, I made coffee strong and called Renee and said I wanted to go over my testimony one more time. We did it 3 times that week. She'd play knocks and she was good at it, mean and smooth, trying to trip me on a date, get me flustered, talk over my answers. The first time I stumbled. The second time I got angry, which she said was worse than stumbling. The third time I found the thing I needed, and it wasn't cleverness. It was stillness. You don't have to win the argument, she told me. You just have to be exactly who you are, slower than they want you to be. I wrote that on a card and put it in my purse next to the square of quilt. I woke before the alarm the morning of the hearing the way I'd woken before the alarm for 40 years. The house was dark and quiet. For a minute I lay there and listened to it, the settle and tick of a house I'd lived in most of my life, and I let myself feel how much I had to lose. Then I got up because feeling it wasn't going to help me, and getting up was. I dressed slow and careful. The navy suit, my mother's small pearl earrings, and Clarence's watch, his good one that I'd kept in my jewelry box 2 years and never worn, because every time I looked at it I heard him say, "I've got you," and I couldn't bear it. That morning I wound it and put it on my wrist. I needed his hand on me, even if it was only a watch. Last I took the square of quilt, the cut corner of Hattie's with the tail of a stitched name still on it, folded it small and pressed it into the inside pocket of my purse where my thumb could find it. I didn't eat. Pearl tried to make me, and I couldn't. I drove myself. Renee had offered to send a car, and I said no, I wasn't going to arrive at that courthouse delivered like a parcel. I was going to drive up under my own power, my own 2 hands on my own wheel, the way I'd done everything else in my life. The streets were just waking. I passed the diner on the way, the blue door dark the chalkboard, blank behind the glass, and I didn't stop, but I slowed, and I said a few words to it, the way you would to a friend you were leaving for a while. The Fulton County Courthouse is a big gray building that makes you feel small the second you see it, which I suppose is the point. I parked and sat a minute with both hands on the wheel, and Clarence's watch ticking against my wrist, and I made myself breathe the way Pearl and I had practiced. And then I saw them across the lot. Terrence was climbing out of a car I didn't recognize. Least I'd learn later, like the watch, like the suit, like the whole shining surface of the life he'd built on sand. Sandra was with him. She looked thin and gray and sick, like a woman who hadn't slept in a week, and she kept her eyes on the pavement. And a step behind them, holding that leather folder against his chest, came Dale Pruitt fresh and rested as a man going to collect a debt. Terrence looked up. And for 1 second, across all that distance, my son and I looked straight at each other. I don't know what I expected to find in his face. Some shame, maybe. Some flicker of the serious boy who nodded once when he got the answer right. But he looked away, first down to the side, anywhere but at me, the same way he couldn't look at me in the petition, the same way he wouldn't be able to look at me across that aisle within the hour. And that's when the last of my fear went out of me. Not because I felt strong, because I understood finally and all the way down that the man across that lot was not coming to his senses. He had chosen. He'd had every chance to undo it, and instead he'd paid a lawyer to tell a judge his mother had lost her mind. So I would let the judge hear the whole story. All of it, including the thing at the back of the folder. Renee met me at the courthouse steps. She looked me over once the suit, the watch, the set of my shoulders, and something in her face eased. "How are you?" she asked. "I'm Ruby Jean Whitfield," I said, "and I keep my own books." She almost smiled. "Then let's go remind them." We went up the steps together. At the metal detectors, I had to take off Clarence's watch and lay it in a little gray bin and walk through without it. And for the 3 seconds it was out of my reach, my heart went strange. Then it came back to me on the other side, and I clasped it on, and we walked down a long, cold hallway toward a door with my own name waiting on the docket beside it. I have walked into a lot of rooms in my life, rooms where I was the only woman, Rooms where I was the only one who knew what the numbers really said. I had never once walked into a room to be told I didn't exist. I pushed the door open and went in to be told exactly that. All rise. Judge Theodore Coleman came in like weather unhurried, gray-headed, his robe whispering a man who'd watched every kind of family take itself apart in his courtroom and had stopped being surprised by any of it. We rose, we sat. He looked over his glasses at the petition, then at me, then at Terence, and I could not read one single thing in his face. That was the worst part of him. By the end of the day, I'd learn it was also the best. Knox stood to open. I'll give the man this much, he was good. He didn't sneer. He didn't paint me as a monster. He painted me as something far more dangerous to my own cause. He painted me as beloved. Your Honor, this is not a case about a bad woman. Ruby Jean Whitfield is by every account a pillar of her community. She raised a family. She ran a business. She is loved. He let it sit. But love is exactly why we are here. Because the people who love Mrs. Whitfield have watched with growing alarm the sharp and capable woman they knew begin to slip. Then he laid them out one by one in that reasonable voice. The property tax she forgot. The check that bounced. The medical appointment she missed. Each one true on its face. Each one stripped of everything that made it a lie. He never once said the word crazy. He didn't have to. He just stacked the small things up neat as bricks until they made a wall, and behind that wall he set a confused old woman who needed saving from herself by a devoted son. I sat and listened to a stranger's version of me being built in front of the room. It is a strange and terrible thing to hear your own decline narrated by the very people who manufactured it. I kept my hands folded. I kept my back straight. You just have to be exactly who you are. Renee had told me slower than they want you to be. So I was still. When Knox sat, Renee rose, and her opening was 3 sentences. Your Honor, my client is not slipping. My client is being robbed, and this petition is the cover story. We intend to show you the difference, and we'd ask the court to watch closely who in this room is afraid of the truth and who is the one asking for it. She sat back down. Knox's pen had stopped moving. Good, I thought. Let him wonder. Their first witness was a doctor. Dr. Halverson was a heavy-set man with reading glasses and a manila folder he handled like scripture. Knox walked him through it gently. The doctor testified that he had evaluated me and found his words mild to moderate cognitive impairment consistent with early decline. He spoke of a screening test, a score, a number on a page. He used the kind of words that sound like a verdict because they're hard to argue with executive function. Short-term recall. Diminished capacity to manage complex affairs. It sounded true. That was the horror of it. A man with letters after his name sat in a witness box and said calm as you please that I could no longer be trusted to do the thing I had done every single day for 40 years, and the room listened like it was already settled. Then Renee stood to cross him, and she was not gentle. Dr. Halverson, when did you examine my client? He glanced at his folder. The evaluation is dated. I didn't ask the date on the paper. I asked when you sat across from Mrs. Whitfield and examined her. Look at her. Do you recognize her? A pause. A half-second too long. I see a great many patients. How long was the examination? I'd have to consult my... An hour, 10 minutes. Did you review the ledger she keeps by hand? Did you speak with anyone at the business she's run for 4 decades? Or did everything you found about her decline come to you from the very people petitioning to take her money? Objection, Knox said. Argumentative. Withdrawn. But she'd landed it. She'd landed several. The doctor was vaguer at the end than he'd been at the start, and by the time she sat down, his scripture folder didn't look quite so holy. And I let myself feel for the first time all morning one small flat ember of hope, which is precisely when Knox stood back up and put it out. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to show a brief recording. made by Mr. Whitfield out of concern several weeks before this petition was filed. The lights didn't dim. It was just a screen turned toward the bench, but the whole room leaned in. It was me. It was me in my own kitchen in my housecoat looking for something. My reading glasses, I think. The video had no beginning and no end that made any sense. It just dropped you into the middle of an old woman opening the same drawer twice, asking the same question twice. "Have you seen my glasses, Terence? Have you seen my glasses?" Her voice thin, a little lost, a little frightened. 30 seconds, maybe 40. I knew that morning. I remembered it. It was during the 3 weeks the ground was moving under me when I lay awake, wondering if I was the thing going wrong, when every small confusion felt like proof. He'd been standing in my kitchen with his phone up, and I'd thought he was texting, but the room didn't know any of that. The room only saw what it was meant to see. I watched the judge watch it. I watched a flicker cross his unreadable face. Not cruelty, just a thought. The worst possible thought, maybe. And something in me came loose. My hands folded so neat in my lap started to shake. I pressed them flat. I felt my face go hot. Felt the whole careful stillness I'd practiced begin to crack because there is nothing. Nothing that makes you feel crazy faster than watching a room full of strangers decide that you are. For one long second, I was the woman in that video. Lost in my own kitchen, asking the same question twice. Renee's hand closed over my wrist under the table. Hard, steadying. But she didn't say a word because there wasn't anything to say. The judge said we'd recess for lunch and I had to stand up on legs that didn't feel like mine and walk out of that room while my son refused still to look at me. Renee took me to a small conference room down the hall, a window that looked out on nothing, a paper cup of water she made me drink. I sat down and didn't trust my own voice for a minute. When it came small. That morning, with the glasses. I remember it, Renee. I really had lost them. I really did ask him twice. What if I made myself say it? What if there's something to what they're saying? What if I am? Stop. She said it quiet, but it stopped me. She pulled a chair around so she was facing me knee to knee and looked at me dead on. Ruby Jean, listen to me. Everybody on God's earth loses their glasses. Everybody asks a question twice. You know the difference between you and the woman in that video. They cut the video. They picked 30 seconds out of 70 years and they're calling it your whole mind. That is not a diagnosis. That's editing. I held on to that. I held on to it the way I'd held on to Yolanda's hand reaching across 6 years. It looked bad, I said. It looked bad. She agreed she didn't lie to me, and I'll always thank her for that, too. The morning went to them. I won't pretend it didn't. Then she leaned in, and something shifted under the comfort the litigator coming back up. But Mrs. Whitfield, they put their whole case on a doctor who can't remember examining you and a video of you hunting for your glasses. They went first, and they went loud because loud is all they've got. They have shown us everything they have. She let that settle. We have something they haven't seen yet. I looked at her. Last night, she said, somebody called my office, after hours, left a message I did not expect. This afternoon, I'm going to put a witness on that stand that Mr. Knox and Mr. Pruitt are not ready for. And then, she nodded at my purse on the table between us. We're going to give the court what's at the back of that folder, and the thing you've been carrying since the first Sunday that man sat at your table. My hand went to the purse on its own. My fingers found the soft square of Hattie's quilt first, and I held it a second the way you'd hold a hand. Then they moved past it to the hard little thing I'd carried in beside it, cool against my thumb. The thing I had not told even Pearl about. The thing I'd started doing after the second time Dale Pruitt set his hand on my table and called my life assets. I closed my fist around it. They had the whole morning, I said. My voice had come back to me. Let them have it. We've got the afternoon. Renee stood and held the door. And I walked back toward that cold room a different woman than the one who'd left it, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I had remembered at last that being afraid and being finished are not the same thing. The afternoon began with Renee standing to call her first witness, and the name she said landed in that room like a dropped plate. The respondent calls Sandra Whitfield. For a second, nobody moved. Then Knox was on his feet. "Your Honor," and Dale Pruitt's head came up sharp and across the aisle. I watched my son turn and stare at his wife like he'd never seen her before. Because Sandra was their witness. Sandra was supposed to be on their side of the aisle, and Sandra was standing up smoothing her skirt with both hands walking to the box. She'd called Renee's office at 9 o'clock the night before. I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that my daughter-in-law, the woman who told me on the phone that I wasn't myself, was raising her right hand to swear to tell the truth, and she would not look at her husband either. She wasn't dramatic. That's what I'll remember. No tears, no speeches. She was just tired, bone-tired, the way you get when you've carried a stone uphill so long you can't recall setting it down. Renee asked her gentle questions, and Sandra answered flat, and the flatness was worse than any crying could have been. Yes, she said the tax notice had been taken out of Mama Ruby's mailbox before she could see it. Yes, the bounced check had been a transfer made on purpose to make her look careless with money. The missed appointment. There'd never been an appointment. The card was slipped into her purse. "And the video?" Renee asked. "The video of Mrs. Whitfield looking for her glasses." Sandra was quiet a moment. "Terrence filmed it. Mr. Pruitt told him what to look for. He said—" Her voice caught for the first time, then steadied. "He said a judge remembers an old woman who can't find her glasses. He said to be patient, the moments would come, and to keep the ones that looked the worst." You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. "Mrs. Whitfield," Renee said softly, "why are you here?" And Sandra looked for the first time at me. Not at Terrence. At me. "Because I have 2 children," she said. "And I didn't want them growing up knowing their daddy did this to his mama, and their mama sat there and let him." She swallowed. "And because it was wrong. I knew it was wrong the whole time. I just thought we didn't have a choice. Mr. Pruitt made it sound like there wasn't any other way out of the hole we were in." She stopped, then quieter. "There's always another way out. I'm sorry, Mama Ruby. I should have said so a long time ago." I did not cry. I'd promised myself. "But I'll tell you it cost me." Knox cross-examined her hard, trying to paint her as a bitter woman, turning on her family. Sandra just kept saying the same flat, true things, and the harder he pushed, the worse it looked for his side until he sat down, because there was nothing left to do but stop the bleeding. Then Renee turned to the documents. She started with the thing from the back of my folder, the thing I'd told her to hold. 6 months before any of this came to a head back when the ground first started moving, and I lay awake wondering if I was losing my mind, I had done a quiet thing. I didn't trust the doubt, but I didn't trust myself to ignore it either. So I drove alone, and telling no one to a board-certified neuropsychologist downtown, and I asked her to test me. All of it. Hours of it. Memory, reasoning, judgment, the works. Because if something was wrong with me, I wanted to be the first to know it, not the last. The report was clean. No evidence of cognitive impairment. Fully capable of managing her own affairs. Renee entered it into the record, a real evaluation hours long, by a specialist dated 6 months back, and set it down beside Dr. Halverson's 20-minute folder and let the court look at the 2 of them side by side. One was a photograph. The other was a sketch somebody did from a description over the phone. But that only proved I had my mind. It didn't prove what they'd done with it. So Renee turned to the bank. The mortgage on 1147 Pratt Street. $90,000. She put the loan papers on the screen, and the power of attorney they'd used with my name signed at the bottom. Then, beside it, she put up my actual signature, the one the bank had on file from 1991. They did not match. The one on the POA was a careful, cramped little forgery. Mine has a loop on the J I've made the same way since I was a girl. And the date the POA was supposedly signed in front of a notary, Renee read it out. Then she read out from my green ledger where I'd been that morning at the Blue Door, before dawn, signing for a produce delivery in front of my cook, and 2 delivery men whose names were right there in my own hand. Mrs. Whitfield was not in a notary's office that morning, Renee said. She was opening her diner. She has opened it every morning for 40 years. The one place she has never been is wherever this signature was made. The room had gone very still, and then Renee said, "We have one more thing, Your Honor." She looked at me. I took the hard little thing out of my purse, a small recorder, the drugstore kind, the kind a careful woman might start carrying after a smooth stranger sits at her table twice and calls her life assets. I'd recorded him. Georgia lets you. I'd left it running in my apron pocket the 3rd Sunday Dale Pruitt came to dinner and thought he was talking privately with my son out on my own back porch. Renee pressed play, and Dale Pruitt's smooth voice came out into that courtroom telling my son plain as day that once the old woman was declared incompetent, the mortgage just becomes a line item in the estate. Nobody audits a guardianship the way they'd audit a fraud. She'll never know it's gone. By the time anybody looks, it's just paperwork. I have never in my life heard a room make the sound that room made, which was no sound at all. Dale Pruitt came halfway up out of his chair. His face had gone the gray of his suit. Knox grabbed his arm and hauled him back down, and the 2 of them had a furious, whispered, drowning sort of conversation, while the judge let it happen, watching them over his glasses the way you'd watch a thing go under the ice. Terrence had put his face in his hands. That was the moment the case broke. I felt it break the way you feel a fever break in the night. But Renee wasn't done with me. There was one thing left she wanted the court to have, and it wasn't on paper. The respondent calls Ruby Jean Whitfield. I walked to the box on my own 2 legs. I put my hand on the Bible and swore, and I sat, and I looked out at that cold room at the judge at Pearl in the 2nd row, with her hand over her mouth at my son, who still would not raise his head. Renee's questions were short and kind. My name, my address, the year I bought the diner, who keeps my books. I answered each one plain and slow, the way we'd practice the way you'd answer if you had nothing on this earth to hide. Then she sat, and Knox stood for his cross, and now he was not gentle at all, because Gentle had quit working for him an hour ago. He came at me fast. He thought fast would rattle me. He fired dates and dollar figures, talked over my answers, leaned in, used that word confused like a little knife. "Isn't it true you were confused, Mrs. Whitfield? Isn't it true you don't remember? Isn't it possible at your age?" And I did the only thing I had left, which was the thing Renee had taught me, and Pearl had reminded me, and my whole life had built me to be. I was still. I was slower than he wanted me to be. I let his fast questions hit the quiet of me and fall down. "You don't remember signing that mortgage, do you?" he said. "No, sir," I said, "because I never signed it. You can't remember doing a thing you didn't do." I let it sit. "But I can tell you exactly where I was the morning that paper claims I was in a notary's office. I was at the Blue Door on the corner of Pratt and Vine writing Catfish Friday on a chalkboard in my mother's hand, the way I've written it every Friday for 40 years. There were 3 people there with me. Their names are in my ledger, in my writing. I have never once missed opening that door, not for a storm, not even the morning after we buried my husband. Ask anybody on that street who Ruby Jean Whitfield is. Knox's jaw worked. He should have stopped there. But he was a man who'd lost his footing and didn't know it yet, and he reached for the cruelest thing in the room, which is what men do when they're going under. "You'd have this court believe," he said, "that your own son, a man who loves you, invented all of this, out of greed." And there it was, The question meant to break me dressed up as love. I didn't answer it fast. I want you to know that. I sat with it. Then I turned my head slow and looked across that room straight at Terrence, at my serious boy, who used to nod once when he got the answer right at the man in the suit I'd never bought him, and I waited until the whole room understood I was looking at him. He did not look up. "Sir," I said quietly. I raised my son to look a person in the eye. He has not looked at me one time since he walked into this room. You stand there and ask me to believe my son loves me. I let out a breath, and it was the saddest breath of my whole life. I would settle for him looking at me. The room went so quiet I could hear Clarence's watch ticking on my wrist. The judge let it stay quiet. Knox sat down without another word. There wasn't another word to be had. And I stepped down from that box past the petitioner's table, past Dale Pruitt, who couldn't meet my eyes either, and I walked back to my seat without looking once at my son. Because he'd had the whole morning of my life to look at me, and he hadn't, and I was done waiting on it. I sat down next to Renee. She didn't say anything. She just laid her hand over mine on the table the way Sandra should have, the way Terrence used to. And we waited for the judge. Judge Coleman didn't recess to think. I've come to understand that's a thing that happens when a judge has already decided, and only the words are left. He took off his glasses, folded them, and spoke to the room in a flat, steady voice, going down the petition point by point. He found that the petitioners had failed entirely to prove I was incapacitated. He found, on the contrary, that the evidence showed me fully competent to manage my own affairs, and he said with a glance at Halverson's folder that he had rarely seen an expert opinion entitled to so little weight. He denied the petition. All of it. Then his voice changed. It got quieter, which I'd learned was the dangerous register for Theodore Coleman. He said what he'd heard in his courtroom that afternoon described conduct that went well past a family dispute. He used the words forgery and fraud and exploitation of an elder. That last one is its own crime in Georgia, and a serious one, and he stated for the record that he was referring the matter to the district attorney and that he expected they'd want the recording, the bank documents, and Mrs. Sandra Whitfield's sworn testimony. Dale Pruitt sat very still while the judge said all that. A man like that spends his whole life staying one step back from the edge of the thing, letting other people sign the papers, keeping his own hands clean. The recording had put his hands right in the middle of it. I felt the gavel come down in my chest more than I heard it. Petition denied. 2 words. After everything, 2 words. I didn't celebrate. I want to be honest about that, because the stories always show the woman walking out victorious, chin up, music swelling, and it wasn't like that. I went out to my car in the parking garage, sat down behind the wheel, shut the door, and came apart. Quiet. Alone. The way I do everything. Not because I'd lost because I'd won, and winning meant it was all true. My son had really done it. The judge had really said it out loud. There was no version of the afternoon left where I'd misunderstood, where it was a mix-up, where my boy still loved me the simple way he had in the back booth with his chocolate milk. That door was closed now. I'd closed it myself with a recorder and a ledger and the truth, and it had to be closed, and it still broke my heart to hear the latch. When I could breathe again, I called Pearl. She answered on the first ring. "Welto?" "It's over," I said. She didn't whoop. She knew me too well for that. She just said, "I know it is, baby. I know." And she stayed on the line and didn't say anything else. Let me sit in that garage with a friend's breathing in my ear, which was exactly the right thing, which is why she's been my friend since Mount Olive. Then she said, "You want me to put on coffee?" "Yeah," I said. "I'm coming home." Here is the part they never knew, the part I'd carried longest of all. 2 years back, when Clarence first passed and the grief was so thick I could barely see through it, I did one clear-headed thing in the middle of all that fog. I sat down with the lawyer who'd handled our affairs, Renee's old mentor before he retired, and I put everything we'd built into a trust. The diner, all 4 houses, what savings we had. An irrevocable family trust with me as trustee for as long as I lived, and had my mind and the children Jordan and Imani as the ones it would all belong to after. Irrevocable. That's a hard word. It means this cannot be undone. Not by me, not by a guardian, not by a court order, not by a son, which means all of it. The forged signature, the $90,000, the doctor, the video, the petition, the whole rotten machine they built to have me declared incompetent was for nothing. Even if they'd won, even if the judge had handed Terrence the guardianship gift-wrapped, he could not have touched the diner or the houses because they were already out of my hands and into the children's, and had been for 2 years. My son committed forgery and fraud and broke his mother's heart in open court and risked prison for a key to a door with no room behind it. He found that out on the courthouse steps when Renee told him plain. I watched his face from the car. I've spent a lot of nights since wondering whether the worst thing I did to my son that day was win or was let him learn standing on those steps that he'd thrown his whole life away, reaching for something I'd already put beyond his reach before he ever started reaching. I didn't go to him. There are limits to what a mother can carry, and that one I set down. The DA took the case. I won't pretend that part was clean or quick. Dale Pruitt is facing charges, and his lawyers and the lawyers after them will drag it out the way money always can. Terrence took a plea restitution probation conditions. He is not in prison. I didn't ask the court for mercy on him, and I didn't ask the court to bury him either. I told the truth and let it land where it landed. We are not a healed family. I want to say that plainly because the stories always tie the bow too neat. Terrence and I don't have Sunday dinners. Some mornings I'm so angry I can't see. Some mornings I just miss him. The boy, not the man. Both are true at once, and I've stopped expecting them to make peace. Yolanda calls every Sunday now. We talk about nothing, the weather, the children. 6 years of silence doesn't end. It just gets quieter. It's a start. And Sandra brings the children by. That's the one that surprised me, that the one who turned is the bridge now. Jordan and Imani spend their Saturdays with me. I'm teaching Imani to keep the ledger and pen in her own hand because a screen can lie to you and your handwriting cannot. She writes the specials on the chalkboard in that cursive she copied off the quilt. Smothered pork chops. Catfish Friday. Peach cobbler while it lasts. I reopened the blue door the Monday after the hearing. Same as always. 5:30 in the dark. And in the evenings now I've taken Hattie's quilt back up. The old one with the names. I'm adding to the border Jordan's name and Imani's in my mother's hand. I left a space beside theirs. One empty square, no name stitched in it yet. Maybe someday. Maybe not. That's not a thing I have to decide tonight. People look at a woman my age and make a decision about her before she's said a word. They decide she's soft. They decide she's done that the best of her life is behind her, and the rest is just waiting. My own son made that decision about me. He was not the first, and he won't be the last to be wrong about it. So let me tell you what I know now on the other side of it. Being underestimated is not the same as being weak. Sometimes it's the only advantage you've got, and you'd be a fool to waste it feeling insulted. Keep your records. Write things down in your own hand. Read what you sign, and sign nothing you haven't read. No matter whose soft voice is telling you to rest. Love freely. But understand that love and being used can wear the very same coat, and you owe it to yourself to check the lining. And know this, especially if you're a woman somebody is called too old to count. It is never too late to stand up for your own life. Not at 60, not at 80, not while there's breath in you and a name that is yours. Setting a boundary with someone you love is the hardest thing I have ever done. It nearly broke me. But I would do it again because the alternative was letting them be right about me, and I was not raised to make a liar's job easy. My grandmother stitched my name into a quilt before I could walk, so I'd always know I belonged to somebody. My son tried to lift it back out. He couldn't. You cannot unstitch a woman who knows her own name.